Welcome back to week 8. This week we'll be covering chapter 11 on water resources and pollution. So in this chapter we'll cover where does our water come from and how do we use it, where and why do water shortages occur, how can we increase water supplies and what are some costs of these methods, how can you personally conserve water, what is water pollution, what are its sources and effects, why are sewage treatments and clean water important in developing countries, and how can we control water pollution. Colorado River is the lifeblood of the American Southwest. More than 30 million people and 1.2 trillion regional economies and cities such as Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver depend on its water. But the sustainability of this essential resource is in doubt. Drought, climate change, and rapid urban growth are creating worries about the future of the entire watershed. In 2008, Tim Barnett and David Pierce from the Scripps Institute in California published a provocative article suggesting that both Lake Mead and Lake Powell could reach levels within a decade or so at which neither would be able to either produce power or provide water for urban or agriculture use if no changes are made in current water allocations. The roots of this problem can be traced to the Colorado Compact of 1922, which allocated water rights for the 7 states that adjoin the river. The previous decade had been the wettest in more than 1,000 years. The estimated annual river flow of 18 million acre-feet, negotiators thought that they could allocate was about 20% higher than the 20th century average. As cities have grown, however, and agriculture has expanded over the past century, competing claims for water have reportedly caused tensions and disputes. Climate change is expected to decrease river flows by 10 to 30% over the next 50 years. There may only be half as much water in the river in a few decades as negotiators once thought they had to distribute between the states. Since the year 2000, water levels in Lake Mead in Nevada have been dropping at about 12 feet per year. Estimates are that without changes in current management plans, there's a 50% chance the minimum power pool levels in both Lakes Mead and Powell will be reached by 2017, and there's an equal chance that live storages in both lakes will be gone by about 2021. Already we're at or beyond sustainable limits of the river. Currently, Lake Mead is only 43% full, and Lake Powell holds about 58% of its maximum volume. The shores of both lakes now display a wide bathtub ring of deposited minerals left by the receding water. The American Southwest isn't alone in facing this problem. The United Nations warns that water supplies are likely to become one of the most pressing environmental issues of the 21st century. By 2025, 2/3 of all humans could be living in places where water resources are inadequate. As I'm sure we all know, water is essential for life. Water does things such as dissolve nutrients and distribute them to cells, regulates body temperature, supports structures, and removes waste products. About 60% of your body is water. You could survive for weeks without food, but only a few days without water. Water is also needed for agriculture, industry, transportation, and lots of other human uses. So in short, clean, fresh water is one of our most vital natural resources. So the hydrologic cycle, or what we know as the water cycle, is constantly redistributing water. And this is the cycle that we probably all saw at some point when we were kids in school, where rain brings water down to the ground, water moves through rivers and streams into lakes and the ocean, and water evaporates back up into the sky, and that cycle continues. So water is cycling endlessly throughout the environment. This water evaporates from moist surfaces. It can fall as rain or snow. The water passes through living organisms and then returns back to the ocean. And this is all called the hydrologic cycle. Solar energy drives the hydrologic cycle by evaporating surface water, which becomes rain and snow. Because water and sunlight are unevenly distributed around the globe, water resources are also unevenly distributed. This is showing the distribution of water resources around the world. And what we see here is the average annual precipitation in different areas around the world. Note that wet areas that support tropical rainforests occur along the equator. So if you were to follow the line along the equator here, you can see the wettest areas. So kind of the blues and greens here. And the majority of the world's deserts occur in zones of dry descending air between 20 degrees and 40 degrees north and south. So around about an average of 30 degrees, we see If you were to kind of follow this belt around, we see the deserts in this region here. The distribution of water is often described in terms of interacting compartments in which water resides. Sometimes water stays in these compartments, such as an ocean or a lake, for very briefly, and other times for eons. The length of time that water typically stays in a compartment is called its residence time. On average, a water molecule stays in the ocean for about 3,000 years, for example, before it evaporates and starts through the hydrologic cycle again. Nearly all the world's water is in the oceans, and oceans play a crucial role in moderating the Earth's temperature, and over 90% of the world's living biomass is contained in the oceans. What we mainly need, though, is fresh water. Amazingly, only about 0.02% of the world's water is in a form that's accessible to us and other organisms that rely on fresh water. Of the 2.4% of all water that's fresh, nearly 90% of that is held up in glaciers, ice caps, and snowfields. And most of the ice is located in Antarctica and Greenland and floating on the ice caps in the Arctic. But some of this ice is also located in alpine glaciers and snowfields, which supply water to billions of people. The winter snowpack on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains provides about 75% of the flow in the Colorado River that we talked about in the opening case study. Drought conditions have already reduced snowfall and runoff in the western U.S., and global warming is projected to cause even further declines. Climate change is shrinking glaciers and snowfields nearly everywhere, and in Asia, the Tibetan glaciers that are the source of the 6 world's largest rivers and supply drinking water for 3 billion people are shrinking rapidly. These are warnings that the glaciers could vanish within a few decades, which would bring enormous suffering and economic losses to people around the world. Groundwater makes up our largest source of liquid fresh water that's available to us. Groundwater originates as rainfall that percolates into layers of soil and rock, and the groundwater within 1 kilometer of the surface is more than 100 times the volume of all freshwater lakes, rivers, and reservoirs combined. The water within the ground is divided into 3 different zones: the zone of aeration, the zone of saturation, and the water table. The zone of aeration is a relatively shallow layer of soil that contains both air and water where plants get their moisture. And depending on the landscape type and rainfall amount, the zone of aeration can be a few centimeters to many centimeters deep. The next layer down is the zone of saturation, and this is where all the soil pores are filled with water, and it's a source of water in most wells. The top of this zone is called the water table. The top of the zone of saturation is what we call the water table. If you were to look within the ground, you can see different layers that contain water, and any layer within the ground that contains water is known as an aquifer. Aquifers may be made up of porous layers of sand or gravel, or cracked or porous rock. Below the aquifer are usually layers of impermeable rock or clay that keep water from seeping down below the aquifer. Instead, water usually moves horizontally through the porous layer. It can take a few hours from several years for water to move a few hundred meters through an aquifer. If impermeable layers lay above an aquifer, then pressure can develop within the water-bearing layer, and pressure within the aquifer can make water flow freely at the surface, and we call these free-flowing wells and springs artesian wells. And so it's just where water is being pushed out of the ground from pressure within the aquifer, and water will flow out above the surface of the ground at certain points. Areas where surface water filters into an aquifer are called recharge zones, and most aquifers recharge extremely slowly, and road or house construction or water use at the surface can further slow recharge rates. Contaminants can also enter aquifers through the recharge zones, and urban and agricultural runoff in recharge zones is often a serious problem. The people who don't have access to clean water generally depend on groundwater for drinking and other uses. And every year, 700 cubic kilometers are withdrawn by humans, mostly from shallow, easily polluted aquifers. The 16 largest rivers in the world carry nearly half of all surface runoff on Earth, and a large fraction of that occurs in a single river, the Amazon, which carries nearly as much water as the next 7 biggest rivers together. Lakes contain nearly 100 times as much water as all rivers and streams combined, but much of this water is in a few of the world's largest lakes. Wetlands like bogs, swamps, wet meadows, and marshes also play a vital role, and often people don't realize what an important role they play in the hydrologic cycle. The atmosphere is actually one of the smallest compartments of water, and it contains only about 0.001% of the total water supply, but it's the most important mechanism for redistributing water around the world. An individual water molecule resides in the atmosphere for about 10 days on average. Some water evaporates and falls within hours, and water can travel halfway around the world before it falls and replenish streams and aquifers on land. Perhaps more than any other environmental factor, the availability of water determines the location and activities of people on Earth. Water supplies are resources that are replenished regularly, mainly surface water and shallow groundwater, and water is a renewable resource, but this renewal does take time. And the rate at which we now use water makes it essential that we protect and conserve local water supplies. Renewable water is most plentiful in the tropics, where rainfall is heavy over large land areas. Water withdrawal is the total amount of water taken from a water body, and worldwide agriculture takes about 70% of the total water withdrawal, and that use is increasing. So as we have more people and are producing more food, it's taking more water to produce all that food. Raising a kilogram of grain-fed beef takes more than 15,000 liters of water, whereas raising goats requires at least 90% less water. Rice cultivation, which generally occurs in wet paddies, takes about 3 times as much water as raising potatoes or wheat. So the amount of food you eat actually can make a big difference in your overall water consumption. So you may only think of water as what you actually use from the faucet in your house, but water actually, the type of food that you eat actually makes a big difference on how much water is used overall. So here's a chart showing water usage in food production, and it shows you how much water is required to produce 1 kilogram of some important foods. So as you can see here, corn, potatoes, and wheat, and actually goats take a pretty small amount of water to produce a kilogram of food compared to some other things. So rice takes quite a bit of water to produce, about the same as chicken. But chicken and pork take relatively small amounts of water compared to beef. And chocolate actually takes a lot of water if you were to eat a kilogram of chocolate. Some European countries use 70% of water for industry, whereas less industrialized countries use as little as 5% of water for industry. Cooling water for power plants is the largest single industrial use of water, typically accounting for 50 to 75% of industrial water withdrawal. A rapidly growing demand for water is for biofuel production, and it currently takes about 4 to 5 liters of water to produce 1 liter of ethanol. So we think of the positive benefits of producing biofuel in terms of not using fossil fuels, but it does take water to produce this biofuel, which is a very important resource that we need to be thinking about. So water shortages could possibly limit the complete switch over to biofuels. Domestic use of water includes water for drinking, cooking, and washing. The amount of water used per household varies quite a bit. The United Nations reports that people in developed countries consume an average of about 10 times more water daily than those living in developing nations. Poorer countries can't afford the infrastructure to obtain and deliver water. So this is one reason why people have to live on a lot less water in the developing countries. Clean drinking water and basic sanitation are necessary to prevent communicable diseases and to maintain a healthy life. The United Nations estimates that at least 1 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, and 2.5 billion people don't have adequate sanitation. And as populations grow and more people move into cities and agriculture and industry compete for increasingly scarce water supplies, water shortages are expected to become even worse. The World Health Organization says that an average of about 1,000 meters cubed or 264,000 gallons per person per year is the necessary amount of water for modern domestic, industrial, and agriculture uses. But about a third of the world's current population lives in countries where water supplies don't meet everyone's minimum essential water needs. The biggest problems in water stress and scarcity for humans occur in Africa and Asia, where rainfall is low and poor countries can't afford to adapt to these low rainfall conditions. There's no simple definition for the word drought. What would be an amazingly wet year in a desert might be considered a catastrophic drought in other places. But in general, a drought is an extended period of consistently below average precipitation that has substantial impact on ecosystems, agriculture, and economies. The worst drought in recent United States history in economic and social terms was in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl, when poor soil conservation practices and a series of dry years in the Great Plains created this Dust Bowl. Wind stripped the topsoil from millions of hectares of land, and billowing dust clouds turned days into what looked like nights. Thousands of families were forced to leave farms and migrate to other areas. And as we saw in the opening case study, much of the western United States has been exceptionally dry over the past decade. Even though the Dust Bowl seemed really significant, it only lasted for about 6 years, but some of the mega droughts that destroyed the Anasazi cultures in the 12th and 13th century lasted 25 to 50 years. One major problem in terms of water resources right now is that groundwater supplies are being depleted faster than they're being replenished. And groundwater, again, provides nearly 40% of the fresh water for agriculture and domestic use in the United States. And as we mentioned, it takes time for the groundwater to be replenished into these aquifers, and we're pulling them out of most aquifers much faster than the water is being replaced. And water withdrawal can also, aside from just not having enough water in the aquifers, it can also allow the aquifers to collapse, called subsidence or sinking of the ground surface. And another consequence of aquifer depletion is saltwater intrusion, where the aquifers can actually get saltwater seeping into them and then not be fresh water and not be good for drinking anymore. Dams and canals are an important part of modern civilizations because they can store and redistribute water for farms and cities, and many great civilizations have been organized around large-scale canal systems. Currently, more than half of the world's 227 largest rivers have been dammed or diverted. So there are definitely some benefits to building dams. And as we mentioned, a lot of civilizations have been built around dams and canals as a way to provide water to a lot of people. Dams can also provide hydroelectric power and other things, but there are a lot of downsides to building dams, and probably the one that we're most familiar with here in the Klamath area is the Klamath River dams and the concern of them preventing the movement of salmon. So dams can prevent movement of species who usually would move up and down rivers. The dams can prevent them from moving past those points. There's also an increasing concern that big dams in seismically active areas can trigger earthquakes, and there's more than 70 cases worldwide where large dams have been linked with increased seismic activity. Also, dams trap a lot of sediment, so when water is flowing down the rivers, there's a lot of sediment moving with that water, and a lot of that sediment will get trapped behind the dams. Now, that sediment that's trapped back there over time normally would have reached down to the ocean, and with that sediment not reaching the ocean and a lot less sediment coming to the shorelines, sediment will actually move along shorelines, and when you're not replenishing that sediment, we see a lot of serious coastal erosion going on due to that sediment being blocked behind the dams. There's also an organization called International Rivers, which says that dam projects have forced more than 23 million people from their homes and land, and that a lot of those people still suffer the impacts of this dislocation even years after it occurred. Fortune magazine wrote that water will be to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century, and skirmishes, if not outright warfare, have occurred over insufficient water. And we definitely know that in this region, the Klamath Basin area, the fights over water rights and how important water is to a lot of people. In Kenya, nomadic tribes have fought over dwindling water and grazing, and an underlying cause of the genocide now occurring in the Darfur region in Sudan is water scarcity. There have been at least 37 military confrontations in the past 50 years in which water has been a factor. This chart shows us the predicted relative changes in precipitation for about 2090 to 2099. So you can look at areas with a significant change, either red getting drier or toward blue getting wetter than what they already are. And so you can see that change in water worldwide and which regions are going to get drier and which regions are going to get more moist. Watershed management and conservation are often more economical and environmentally sound ways to prevent flood damage and store water for future use than building huge dams and reservoirs. A watershed or catchment is all the land drained by a stream or river, and it's long been recognized that retaining vegetation and ground cover in a watershed helps hold back rainwater and lessen downstream floods. We could probably save about as much as half of the water that we now use for our domestic purposes without a great sacrifice or serious change in our lifestyle. Simple steps such as taking shorter showers, fixing leaks, washing cars, dishes, and clothes as efficiently as possible can go a long way. Water-conserving appliances such as low-volume shower heads, efficient dishwashers, low-flow toilets can reduce water consumption greatly. Planting native vegetation can also be an ecologically sound thing to do. So they call this xeriscaping, when you plant vegetation that can grow naturally with the water that's in the area. And a lot of native plants have this ability rather than planting more ornamental type plants. So planting things in your garden and yard that can grow with just the rainfall that you receive rather than needing to be watered a lot each year. So Las Vegas is actually paying residents to replace turf with natural vegetation and are asking golf courses to rip up their fairways. Toilets are actually our greatest use of domestic water. And this chart shows us the amount of water that we use on various different things. So we use a lot of water on toilets, laundry, showers, and faucets. And surprisingly, a pretty large amount of water, almost as much as we use from our faucets, is used in, well, not really used, but wasted in leaks. So what can you do? A couple things, easy changes you can make, or don't flush every time you use the toilet. We've probably all heard the expression, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. So that slogan came up because toilet water is a big use of our overall water. You can also take shorter showers and shower instead of taking baths. You could put a brick or full water bottle in your toilet tank to reduce the volume of water in each flush. You can use water conserving appliances like low flow showers, low flush toilets, and aerated faucets. And gray water, which is water that's recycled from other sources, such as water after your shower, could be used for flushing, but installing separate plumbing systems to catch this gray water can be really expensive, so it's not always cost effective to do that. Growing recognition that water is a precious and finite resource has encouraged conservation. Despite a growing population, the U.S. is now saving some 38 million gallons per day compared with per capita consumption rates of 30 years ago. So this is very positive that even though our population has grown, we are actually using a bit less water per day than what we used to use. New requirements for water-efficient fixtures in many cities help conserve water in the homes. Pricing may also affect our water usage. Next, we're going to move on to water pollution, and any physical, biological, or chemical change in water quality that adversely affects living organisms or makes water unsuitable for desired uses can be considered pollution. There are natural sources of water contamination, such as poison springs, oil seeps, and sedimentation from erosion. However, here we're going to focus primarily on the human-caused changes that affect water quality and usability. There's two different sources of pollution, point sources and non-point sources. And point sources discharge pollution from specific locations such as drain pipes, ditches, or sewer outfalls such as factories, power plants, sewage treatment plants, underground coal mines, and oil wells. Non-point sources have no specific location where they discharge into a particular body of water, including runoff from farm fields and feedlots, golf courses, lawns and gardens, construction sites, logging areas, roads, streets, and parking lots. The most serious water pollutants in terms of human health worldwide are pathogenic or disease-causing organisms. And among the most important waterborne diseases are typhoid, cholera, bacterial and amoebic dysentery, enteritis, polio, infectious hepatitis, and schistosomiasis. If any coliform bacteria are present in a water sample, then it's common that infectious pathogens are usually present. So they'll do tests sometimes on water testing, which you'll get to do in your lab this week, to see if there's any coliform bacteria present. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have infectious pathogens, but it's usually a good indicator that infectious pathogens may be present. So oxygen is removed from water by respiration and chemical processes that consume oxygen. So for example, fish, use and other things, plants that live in the water will use oxygen. And because oxygen is so important in water, dissolved oxygen levels are often measured to compare water quality in different places. Organic materials such as sewage or paper pulp and water increase oxygen consumption by decomposers. Biological oxygen demand is the amount of dissolved oxygen consumed by aquatic microorganisms, and chemical oxygen demand is a measure of all organic matter and water. And so also this week during lab, you're going to be measuring dissolved oxygen in the water samples that you look at, and biological oxygen demand. Bodies of water can have different levels of nutrients in them, and if a river or lake has low levels of nutrients, they will look more clear, so you won't see the green algae and a lot of growth. And so if they have clear water and low biological productivity, they're said to be oligotrophic, which means little nutrition. On the other hand, waters that have a lot of organisms and organic material are said to be eutrophic, which means well nourished. And sometimes human activities can increase eutrophication, or water essentially has too many nutrients. This is called cultural eutrophication. So for example, if sewage runoff runs into a lake, all the nutrients from the sewage can cause overgrowth of algae and other organisms in the water, other plant and algae type organisms, and this overgrowth can use up a lot of the oxygen in the water and make that oxygen not be available to organisms that rely on oxygen, such as fish and other organisms living in the water. Here's a picture of what a eutrophic lake looks like. So you're going to see a lot of growth around the lake, a lot of algal growth within the lake. Eutrophication can also occur in marine ecosystems, so not just in lakes and rivers, but partially enclosed seas such as the Black, Baltic, and Mediterranean seas tend to be especially susceptible to eutrophication. And effluents from waste from nearby large cities may be dumped untreated into the sea. Beach pollution, fish kills, and contaminated shellfish result. Extensive dead zones often form where the rivers dump nutrients into the estuaries and shallow seas. Excessive nutrients support blooms of these deadly aquatic microorganisms, causing things like red tides. Some toxic chemicals are naturally released into the water from weathering rocks, but humans can accelerate this process by our actions. So among the chemicals of greatest concern are heavy metals such as mercury, lead, tin, and cadmium. And these heavy metals are highly persistent, and they accumulate in food chains and affect humans. Mercury is released from incinerators and coal-burning power plants and is the most widespread toxic metal contaminant in North America. So here's a sign showing fish consumption or advisory that you need to be careful on eating fish from certain areas that may have a lot of mercury. And so different fish can typically contain different levels of mercury, and also where the fish are caught can determine how much mercury is present in those fish. There are two principal sources of toxic organic chemicals in water, and these are improper disposal of industrial and household waste, and also pesticide runoff from farm fields, forests, roadsides, golf courses, and private lawns. So the question would be is if all this water that is in these natural sources is becoming polluted, is it safer to drink bottled water? And it's become trendy over time to drink bottled water. Every year, Americans buy about 28 billion bottles of water at a cost of about $15 billion, with the mistaken belief that it's safer than their tap water. About a quarter of all bottled water in the United States is simply reprocessed city water, and much of the rest of it's drawn from groundwater aquifers, which may or may not be safe, depending on what is above the ground and could be leaking into the groundwater. A recent survey of bottled water in China found that 2/3 of the samples tested had dangerous levels of pathogens and toxins. Sediment and heat can also influence water quality. Sediment's a natural part of river systems, and it fertilizes floodplains and create fertile deltas. But certain human activities like farming and urbanization can cause too much sediment in the rivers, which can lead to problems. We also can have what they call thermal pollution, which is heat coming into the rivers, and usually this is heat that's given off from things like power plants and other industries that are using water to cool various systems, and hot water is given off in this process, and it can raise water temperatures high above normal levels, and this can affect water quality and the organism's ability to live in that water. Silt and sediment are considered the largest source of water pollution for the United States. Let's look next at water quality today. Surface water pollution is often both highly visible and one of the most common threats to environmental quality. In more developed countries, reducing water pollution has been a high priority over the past few decades. Billions of dollars have been spent on control programs, and considerable progress has been made, but still there's a lot left to do. The 1972 Clean Water Act was developed to protect our water, and this act was established. It established a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, which requires an easily revoked permit for any industry, municipality, or other entity dumping waste into surface waters. The permit requires disclosure of what is being dumped and gives regulators valuable data and evidence for litigation. As a consequence, only about 10% of our water pollution now comes from industrial and municipal point sources. One of the biggest improvements has been sewage treatment. Nearly everyone in urban areas is now served by municipal sewage systems, and no major city discharges raw sewage into a river or lake except as overflow during heavy rainstorms. The goal of the 1972 Clean Water Act was to make all U.S. water surfaces fishable and swimmable, and we have not reached that goal yet. Not all lakes and rivers are fishable and swimmable, but we've made substantial progress since the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. The greatest impediments to achieving national goals in water quality in both the United States and Canada are sediment, nutrients, and pathogens, especially from non-point discharges of pollutants. About 3/4 of the water pollution in the U.S. comes from soil erosion, fallout of air pollutants, and surface runoff from urban areas, farm fields, and feed. Here's a chart looking at the leading causes of surface water impairment, and so you can see pathogens is at the top. Mercury and other metals are very high. Too many nutrients and sediment put into the water are also very high on the list. And then you can see some other things as we go down the list that are not as common, but are still things that are influencing our water quality. Developing countries often have serious water pollution. Despite the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, parts of Russia, along with the Balkans and Central Asia, remain extremely polluted. It's estimated that 70% of China's surface water is unsafe for human consumption, and that water in half the country's major reservoirs is so contaminated that it's unsuited for any use. In places like Haiti, ditches can serve as open sewers where they dump all their waste and sewage. And there can be a lot of serious health risks to living under these conditions. So a lot of pathogens that are transported in that waste and moved into people's drinking water can seriously impact the way of life there. Groundwater, so we mentioned it takes a long time to recharge. It's one of our most important freshwater sources, and it's also especially very hard to clean up. So about 1/2 of the people in the United States, including 95% of those in rural area, depend on underground aquifers for their drinking water, and it's threatened in many areas by overuse and pollution by a wide variety of industrial, agricultural, and domestic contaminants. The EPA estimates that 1.2 trillion gallons of contaminated groundwater seep into the ground in the U.S. When deep underground aquifers are contaminated, it's possible but expensive to pump water out of aquifers, clean it, and then pump it back in. So although that's possible, it's really expensive and probably not likely that that's going to be done in most cases. This picture here shows you some sources of groundwater pollution. So things like septic systems, landfills, and industrial activities on aquifer recharge zones can leach contaminants into aquifers. Wells provide a direct route for injection of pollutants into aquifers. Ocean pollution has few controls, so coastal bays, estuaries, shoals, and reefs are often overwhelmed by pollution. Dead zones and poisonous algal blooms are increasingly widespread. Toxic chemicals, heavy metals, oil, sediment affect some of the most attractive and productive ocean regions. Discarded plastic is becoming a ubiquitous mark of human impact on the oceans, and 6 million metric tons of plastic are tossed from ships every year into the ocean, where they get tangled on animals, things like birds, mammals, and even fish. So the plastic that's dumped into the ocean can, aside from having huge masses of plastic within the ocean, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, this plastic can have a huge impact on the animals living there. The cheapest and most effective way to reduce pollution is to avoid creating it in the first place. And eliminating lead from gasoline has resulted in a widespread and significant decrease in the amount of lead in the U.S. surface waters. Industry can reduce pollution by recycling or reclaiming materials that otherwise might be discarded in the waste stream. Using this approach, companies can extract valuable metals and chemicals and sell them instead of releasing them as toxic contaminants into the water system. So non-point sources are often a lot harder to control than point sources, for the simple fact that if it's a point source and we know exactly where the pollution is coming from, it's a lot easier to fix that problem and clean it up. Non-point sources, we don't know exactly where they're coming from, and they can be a lot harder to control. So typically our farming practices use a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, and those things, when rain comes, those things are all washed from the fields and washed into our either groundwater or into our rivers, and would be considered a non-point source of pollution. In urban areas, it's essential to reduce waste that enters storm sewers, and nutrient pollution is a big challenge in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's degraded the bay, but implementation of pollution prevention measures and planting of seagrass and wetlands has been one thing done there that has helped. So how do we treat municipal waste? Under natural conditions, water purification occurs constantly in soils and water. So this is out in nature. But the high population densities of cities produce a lot more waste than the natural systems can process. Most developed countries require that cities and towns build municipal water treatment systems to purify the human and household waste. and most rural households use septic systems, which allow solids to settle in a tank where bacteria then decompose them. Municipal treatment has 3 different levels of quality. So there's primary, secondary, and tertiary treatment. And sanitary engineers have developed this system to help treat wastewater. So primary treatment physically separates the large solids from the waste stream with screens and settling tanks. Secondary treatment uses aerobic bacteria to break down dissolved organic compounds. So you're using bacteria to break down some of that waste. And then tertiary treatment removes dissolved metals and nutrients, things like nitrates and phosphates, to leave you with clean water. Here's a picture of a municipal wastewater treatment. But conventional treatment misses some of the new pollutants that we're now aware of. In 2002, the USGS released the first ever study of pharmaceuticals and hormones in streams. Scientists sampled 130 streams looking for 95 contaminants, including antibiotics, natural and synthetic hormones, detergents, plasticizers, insecticides, and fire retardants. All of these substances were found in low concentrations. So what are the effect of these widely used chemicals on our environment or on people consuming the water? For a lot of these, we don't know the full effects. So a lot of tests are being done, a lot of speculation on how serious these things are. But the fact that the antibiotics and hormones and other things are getting into our water system and being redistributed to everyone, in a lot of cases, probably not the best thing. So here's some examples of some unusual pollutants that are now being detected in surface waters. Things like steroids, non-prescription drugs, insect repellent, detergents, disinfectants, fire retardants, antibiotics, hormones, and other prescription drugs. So are all things that are being found in surface water. Natural wastewater treatment can be an answer. Constructed wetlands are complexes of artificial marshes designed to filter and decompose waste. And one of the best known of these is in Arcata, California, but similar wetland waste treatment systems are now operating in many developing countries. Alternative waste treatment systems also can include things like the Cedar Grove Cheese Factory, which built a living machine, which is a sequence of tanks, bacterial algae, and small artificial wetlands. And the system converts factory waste, factory runoff, to nearly pure water and wetland flowers. So certain organisms, like certain types of plants, can actually be very effective at cleaning up water, and using living organisms to clean contaminated water is known as bioremediation. Restored wetlands, for instance, along stream banks or lake margins, can effectively filter out sediment and remove pollutants. Some plants are really efficient at taking up heavy metals and organic contaminants, and bioremediation offers exciting and inexpensive alternatives to conventional cleanup. Water pollution control has been among the most broadly popular and effective of all environmental legislation in the United States. It hasn't been without controversy, however. Some of the most important water legislation in the United States are described in the next table. So things like the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. There's quite a few that are listed out here in your book that were important water quality legislation. The passage of the U.S. Clean Water Act of 1972 was a bold bipartisan step that made clean water a national priority. Along with the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Air Act, it's one of the most significant and effective pieces of environmental legislation ever passed by Congress. The ambitious goal of the Clean Water Act was to return, as we mentioned earlier, all U.S. surface waters to fishable and swimmable conditions. That's the end of our Week 8 lecture. So just in conclusion here, water is a very important resource, and as human populations grow, water is likely to become even more scarce in the future. Conflicts over water rights are becoming more common between countries that share water. U.S. federal, state, and local pollution controls have greatly improved our water quality in most places. In rapidly developing countries such as China and India, water pollution still remains a serious threat, though. Constructed wetlands for ecological sewage treatment, on the other hand, can provide low-tech, inexpensive ways to reduce pollution. That's the end of our week 8 lecture, and I'll be in touch with you again in week 9.